Last time, half the team was captured. Now, it's Cyclops, Phoenix, Nightcrawler, and Dazzler to the rescue. But will they reach Chicago in time to save Kitty Pryde? Find out in Run for Your Life, next on the Dark Phoenix Saga Review. Hello, Internet, and welcome to the third chapter of the Dark Phoenix Saga Comic Community Review. We're going to be, this time, talking about issue 131 of the original Uncanny X-Men run, Run for Your Life. So, originally printed in March 1980, this was a different era of comics. This wasn't being advertised and wasn't being brought up like a big major event. Now, definitely there's some things going on because there's suddenly this onslaught of new introductions. As we've seen in prior issues, there's been Kitty Pryde, there's been the Dazzler, there's been the entirety of the Hellfire Club, which wasn't completely new because of the Mastermind having shown up before. But very notably, we have Emma Frost, the White Queen, which, as we all know, became a major key player later in the X universe. There's an interesting twist in this issue in particular pertaining to that, which I want to get to. So as we open up, Kitty Pryde is being chased down by a car, and you can see that amidst all the floating heads of the X-Men. That one's for you, Travis. And she is quickly saved by the Phoenix, who is a bit overzealous while saving her. Cyclops makes a point to it, but she says, I'm psychic. I could feel the fear in Kitty's mind. And so these monsters got what they deserved. And you're starting to see this tipping of power, this more willing to, at this point it isn't abuse of power, but more willing to be more overzealous with it. And you're seeing this development of how the Phoenix is treating things, and you're seeing the slight twinge on the team of how they're not as comfortable with her. They're not afraid of her yet, but there's definitely an unease about the whole situation. But then, to show that it's still Jean Grey, she goes and she finds Kitty, who's scared out of her mind. And for that, she's actually able to find Kitty very easily, and they make a point of that, of her being such a powerful psychic. But she comes and she changes into civilian clothes and does everything to ease Kitty, and is very much that almost Mary Sue character that Jean Grey is, and it's a very interesting juxtaposition, just from one page to the next, and it's amazing how much interplay there is there in just 2 pages. Normally you'd have to be reading, an entire 2 different issues now to be getting that sort of interplay, but here it is just back to back. Then Dazzler is quick to point out in only the 2nd issue she's ever appeared in as to just how useless she really is. Now, remember that bit I mentioned with the White Queen earlier and how it would be interesting this issue? It's right here when Phoenix, Jean Grey, is scanning one of the goons' minds of the Hellfire Club and finds out that they are actually tied to the Hellfire Club because they have been on the other end of this and just receiving Kitty's call and all that. And Jean Grey finds out that none other than Jason Wingrade is part of this, and she's been having all these psychic dreams about supposedly a relative of hers dealing with the same man but of the past, and now she's realizing that it's present. What's really funny is she has this incredibly guilty look, and Cyclops says, "Are you okay, Jean?" And there she is, just like, "Oh, nothing. Oh, nothing. I'm just having a psychic affair. Don't worry about it. A few decades from now, I'll just be on your ass for doing the exact same thing." Oh, it's just so funny to read it now and then know where things are going, and just seeing that fight coming, and it's funny to know where all the characters end up years later. And then we cut away, and Kitty Pryde manages to sneak her way back into the Hellfire Club, and this is pretty incredible, so I want to point it out. Kitty Pryde comes up, and she saves Wolverine and Colossus from being encaged while still learning to use her powers. This is her first romp out, and she is saving two of the most powerful characters in the Marvel Universe. This is important because with the phasing out of the old, as we all know is coming, we're seeing the coming in of this new character, this new young girl, and she's already proving herself to be an incredibly useful part of the team, even though she's very much a teenager, still very much keen to all these vulnerabilities. She's overcoming them in mere panels. It's almost too much, but the way it's written, she's not seeing anything else to do, and she needs them as much as they need her at this point. And so it's an interesting dynamic, and it's interesting to see that it's basically all subtext. Like, you're supposed to be getting that, or you're supposed to be skipping over it. And then the rest of the X-Men, Nightcrawler, Cyclops, and Phoenix, use the Trojan horse approach to get into the Hellfire Club to save their teammates. And then, behold, the only time that the Dazzler is useful in this entire run. And then the X-Men break in, and then we have what's again interesting given the unmeant subtext of knowing the future between these two characters. You have the almost psychic catfight between the White Queen and the Phoenix. And the White Queen's meant to look very menacing and almost evil. And you have Jean come up in this pose that's very much this 80s comic. In order to get a pose like this, you have to be reading a different caliber of comic now. But I swear to God, I know this woman's supposed to be, perfect in every way, but the ass shot here, that is not of a white woman. That is just, it's a little too much, and the framing just takes away from the entire intensity of the moment. Like, literally the page before, they essentially have an ass shot of Cyclops and Nightcrawler and Dazzler, and they're all running down the thing, and it's like a perspective thing to show they're coming from the other way. But here it is just an ass shot, and the White Queen right before the Phoenix basically just psychically wins the fight off panel, and here it is just for you to see, just to focus on, just to understand that it was kind of a different time, and this is the kind of subtle sexism that doesn't even pass really in comics today unless it's supposed to be like a TNA comic. Another bit here is the great play of powers with Nightcrawler, where he's learning to teleport right after he punches, so he's able to take out a bunch of goons fairly quick. And it's this great interplay, but it's this idea of they're understanding the powers and they're trying to play with it in different ways. They're trying to show that you can do different character bits with these things, but it also shows how the action of the X-Men also plays to the character of the X-Men, so you're getting a little more out of it. And then in a devastating move that really kind of takes this from... This panel really shows the transition from when they're really just dealing with the Hellfire Club, and it's really this just Hellfire Club lead-in, and we really get to the start of the Phoenix Saga, where it's just this unbridled, unpredictable show of power that literally brings down the house and grabs the attention of everyone in the immediate area. How powerful this Phoenix Force is, and just Jean comes out of it. She's the only one who's essentially unfazed by this moment, and it's interesting here as it's a smaller thing, but we'll notice later when it happens it's a much bigger thing, but it's essentially the same show of force, just magnified a bunch of times. So just take note of this frame. And then there's a small sequence in which Jean and the X-Men come back and are bringing Kitty back to her parents, and they are livid. Rightfully so. I mean, their daughter was taken from what was supposed to be an outing to meet some potential school officials, not even students, and she ends up in a life or death situation. How much of that they're aware of isn't exactly apparent, but they know she was in danger. And Jean just says, we don't need to deal with this, and flips the switch on their mind, and they become incredibly polite, and they love and they want to send Kitty to their school. Which is obviously an abuse of power and plays into showing how she's being much more liberal with her power, and again, the team is uncomfortable. This is something that they obviously don't fear, but they're uncomfortable with it. And, but what's also really interesting about this is Kitty Pryde, in a lot of ways, is coming in to be a new character and do all this, but in some ways she's also there to replace Jean. I mean, it's a female for female switch, which is good because X-Men is one of the few things that is very good about the demographics as far as fiction tends to go. But in order to do so, it took an illicit act of the prior at her most corrupt to bring in the new at essentially her most pure. And you can read into that how you want. That might be overplaying it a bit, but it's an interesting twist that the fact that she's led into the schools because her parents very clearly had their mind altered. And I haven't read the issues pertaining right to when Kitty comes into the school, but I don't think they really play on that. And it's interesting that it's something that's not really ever brought up, and that in some ways Kitty has a lot of reverence for Jean, though she never really knew her until later but you think in some ways she'd almost despise her or not hold her in the esteem that everyone else does. And it's just an interesting thing to just have this weird character interplay when it's really supposed to be almost a replacement. So I just found that such a bizarre and great interplay. So while I feel the seeds are really being sown here, we still haven't really gotten to the meat of the action. And we're going too soon. We have the first kind of... Well, if you were treating this like a 3-arc structure, this would be kind of an odd end to the first act. But in reality, this is not a 3-act structure at all, and it is very much serialized, and certain major plot elements being set up here will not pay off till much, much later. And there's also some other great things. And there's some other notes that were sprinkled throughout that I kind of didn't really mention, such as you really see the initial attraction between Peter and Kitty, even though at this time Kitty seems far too young, and that's very apparent. But the crush thing there's nothing wrong yet, and also there's also a touch of a weird class element here that was more brought up in the Dazzler issue that I kind of wanted to touch on, where you have the X-Men roll up in a Rolls Royce, and again they're coming in a similar car here. But when they come to the Hellfire Club, which is their enemy, that seems much more fitting because it's on that level. But when they go to find the Dazzler there at this weird, bizarre nightclub, they don't fit in. And that's interesting to me because the X-Men are very much about being other. But in many respects, this high affluent society with all their quirks and all that is where the X-Men tend to fit in better because they've been so groomed and so brought up by Professor Xavier. Really save Wolverine, who's very much on the outskirts of the team, more fringe, more down and dirty, more all that. And it's much more apparent here in much more subtle ways. While they're all wearing suits, he's wearing more of a... I know it's supposed to be Canadian, but it looks like a Texan suit with the, 2-string tie, 10-gallon hat sort of thing. And he looks like a freaking cowboy when everyone else is trying to look dressed up and nice. And he's wearing formal attire, but more for a different region, for a different kind of class thing. And it's also interesting that at this point, most of the characters are white, but the diversity within white is still very apparent. I mean, you have Colossus, who's Russian, and it's funny to read him here because you get touches of what should be Russian, but you don't really get the feeling of an accent, and that's just because it's a comic, which is interesting. You get Kitty Pryde, who isn't overtly Jewish yet, but you can kind of tell. And then there's Nightcrawler, who's obviously German, but he's also blue. And it's interesting to have that they're playing with that kind of diversity, and also Wolverine being Canadian, but they don't have the very apparent black character except for Storm, who's more notable for being there, and she's written such a different light. She's written with the idea that she has lockpicks around, and so that it's interesting because as a female character, and especially the X-Men getting locked up all the time, she has a way out of that, and that was very much part of her character early on, and why the headdress was so important. And they make note of that here when Emma Frost is saying, no, take away her headdress so that she cannot escape, and they pat her down for all this other stuff, and then Storm's actually left bound again. Despite the fact that she's normally prepared for such a thing, they still have to bind her, which you could read in however you want. But it's just interesting to see that level of diversity and that level of something coming out, which is something that a lot of comics are still struggling with. And it's funny to see that it came so naturally to the X-Men, and very clearly because of Claremont and Byrne's influence, because that it didn't happen by accident. It clearly happened by design, especially in a day when this was much more out of the norm than it is even now. And it's interesting to see some of that play forward, where today we had the X-Men 1 by issue 1, whatever, by Brian Wood come out, which has the all-female cast. And we're still seeing that incredible level of diversity, and it's just something I wanted to touch on because this is the age of the X-Men where that really came out, whereas X-Men was always talking about it. This is that era. It's interesting to see in this issue where that diversity is not in the most overt parts that people keep talking about, but also in the class stuff, and it's very written and very planned. And it's just so interesting to see that subtlety while things are flying by so fast. And whereas I do understand that a lot of people feel that the art isn't as strong as some other things, I feel like the motions there, the backgrounds are there, and it's very much art to convey the point and not much else. But the expressions are completely there, the backgrounds are there, though a bit minimalized, and all the characters are very colored, although the details on them are very much to allow the colors to pop out. It's very much to allow simplicity, but I mean the hair is so much more curly than straight, which is interesting. It makes it feel a lot more tangible. The characters don't feel like they have such impossible body types, despite the fact that they're all Adonises and goddesses. They seem a touch more rounded, just even in the way they look. And it's just, it's so great to see this level of power and this level of detail and this level of words in a comic, and I just feel that this issue in particular is such a great entry because it's such a subtle build-up. Like, this is just some heroes that were captured and they're escaping, but the interplay that I discussed before shows the raising of states, sets the seed for the stuff that's going to become so incredibly epic, but it's grounded in what is just really a normal superhero kind of tale. And we're going to see just a little bit more setup, and then things are really going to take off. So, stay tuned for issue 132, as presented by none other than Comic Uno, with "And Hellfire is their name."